Alright guys, we're gonna jump in and start the part where we actually try to Photoshop a section drawing. Now, I'm gonna assume that you guys have a SketchUp model that like this, or something that you can work with basically for this stage of the exercise. Now, there's a couple things that you should do as part of the setup, and you want to figure out, okay, which section you actually want to use for this. And I think in this case, we're going to use this one. So once you've kind of picked the section, you want to eventually save the view and all that stuff. But before you actually do that, you probably want to change your view styles to something that's a bit cleaner and easier to edit. So go to Window, Styles, right? And under the sort of pull down, find either in the default styles. I usually suggest this one, the hidden line. So click on it to change everything to the hidden line style. Make sure that your section planes, these guys, are off. So view section planes, uncheck it, right? And you'll remember that this actually is a perspective. So you will need to go to your camera menu here and change it to parallel projection, which you can see actually can make some pretty interesting diagrams already. And you can turn the shadow off, right? Like that. This is up to you. It's the same thing. You can go to Window, Shadows, pull out the sort of window for the shadow settings to turn them on or off. Depending on what you're trying to do. But here we're actually just going to use the views here, the ISO view. So this is an ISO view top. So just to kind of find, okay, this is, I guess this is the back view, at least in this case, right? So use that to kind of orient you in exactly, right? Now, this is actually what you want to export. Now, the one thing I sometimes find helpful is not only to change the view style like this, but in here, I guess this is the styles panel. In this guy, which is hidden line by default, click on the monochrome. Because when you click on the monochrome, it colors in these parts, which in the model should be solid, right? So these are actually the section cuts. So to help you, it'll help you identify which parts you need to poche in eventually in the section drawing. So this is actually helpful or beneficial. Once you're happy with that, I would just sort of add a new scene just so you can save that and eventually get back to this, right? So that is sort of the setup, and you can decide whether or not you want to export one with shadows. You'll probably have to, I don't know, play around with it to figure out if you can actually get it to work correctly for what you want. This is probably just like the wrong direction for this model to get any shadows, so I'm just going to turn them off. Yeah, and you'll want to export that. So here, go to File, Export to the graphic, and remember, I'm going to put this on my desktop. I guess Intro Lab 3. And call this section 01. And actually make sure to save it as a PNG file right here. And then also in the options, this is the view size. Originally the view size is 1844, and like I said, because if you're just like getting sort of these lines, they kind of are a little bit too thick, and they're not so good. The line quality isn't that great. So, in the options, usually double your view size. So this is, instead of 906, it's 1812, for example, right? And to alias, say OK. Section 1.png, export. And it'll think for a little while, but you should get a PNG file that looks like that. All right, so you're done with SketchUp. Open that PNG file in Photoshop. So this is Photoshop, open, find that PNG file, and okay. So this was brought in like that as a background. So one of the things you could do is, if you eventually wanted to, obviously you want to unlock the background, so double click on it, say okay, use the magic wand, or quick, this is actually the quick selection, use the magic wand tool, and try and see if you can basically sort of delete out, you know, some of the unnecessary white stuff that's the background. And you might have to kind of refer back to your model to figure out, okay, which parts of this really is should be clear. And so one way to do that is just like look at this, right? And some of the parts of it is wall. You just have to kind of look at it and say which parts of your design is wall, which part is window, what is, you know, sort of seen or not seen, or actually just change it to this. And so okay, that the gray parts should be solid, but this this part should be clear, right? So you can go back in here and, you know, say okay, that's clear, and that looks about right, roughly. This guy, just delete it out, right? Something like that, and just a little housekeeping. Okay, and that's going to be the basis. Okay, so the first thing you probably want to do after that is actually just to poche the section cut. And as always, there's several different ways to do it. Obviously, first, in the case that you want to make your section cut completely black, then get a black color, and then if you simply have this layer 0 as your active layer, the sort of simple way is actually to use the paint bucket tool, which is here. The shortcut key for is G, and use the paint bucket tool and basically just click on, you know, if you have nice closed sections, it usually has pretty good boundary detection, right? Oops. And you can zoom in a little bit and you can just basically fill these parts in one by one. Now the sort of downside is that you'll see these little seams, right, and where it doesn't actually, you know, paint it in perfectly, and you also run the risk of actually overpainting. If I click on it a couple of times, you'll see, you know, the sort of painting region actually starts to grow, enlarge, and bleed into other parts of your drawing. So that's not always the best, and I'm just going to undo all of that. So what I actually really do suggest is to use a different strategy. Now, remember we said, you know, layers they basically sort of function like transparencies or trace paper, so you can layer a lot of layers on top of each other, and you can move things around. So what we're going to do is actually create a new layer, and you can double click on it, double click on the name here and rename it, and just call it let's say poche. Okay, and it's always kind of like a good idea to rename this. So in this case, I'll just rename layer 0, let's say base drawing, for example. Right. So this is poche, and what you'll have to do is actually you'll have to jump back between these two. One way to do it, obviously, is actually just to make the poche layer the active layer, make sure it's highlighted, and then, for example, use this. The rectangular marquee tool, and sort of bracket out, and you can kind of zoom in a little bit if you need more precision, right? But you can actually just bracket out a selection set like that, right? And then switch to the paint bucket tool, paint it in. And I actually did 2 selections there, so just go back to one. Bracket out the selection, paint it, you know, Control D, deselect, right? And then go back to the rectangular marquee tool using the M key, and then select that and fill it in. Obviously, whoops. And obviously you can actually do sort of multiple selections if you want. You can also use the polygonal lasso tool to do this part, which is sort of like a diagonal. And so you can also do that as well. Holding down the shift key will constrain your movement to X and Y, so it's useful in these situations where you know it wants to be horizontal. And if you make a mistake with the polygonal lasso, you can click on your backspace or type backspace to go back. Do that, shift, that, and complete the circle, right? G, and fill that in. Right, so that's one way. The other way actually is to, when you're selecting stuff, go back to the base drawing. So make the base drawing active and use your wand, or not the quick selection, but the magic wand. And actually, you can sort of multi-select the regions that you want to color in first, together, like this. And then switch back or click on the poche layer, switch to your paint bucket, G, and then color it in. And that basically does all your selections together. So obviously there are, sometimes there are advantages, disadvantages to doing it this way or the other, but I think this probably will cover most of the sort of possible situations that you're looking for. And so basically what you do is you just sort of go through it. If you have more orthogonal stuff, then it's probably just simpler to keep on the poche layer and just use your rectangular marquee, because since that basically more or less ensures that everything is orthogonal. So it goes really quick. You can overlap, it really doesn't matter since you're just sort of paint bucketing things in. And actually some of these, eventually we might look at what they really are. They actually might want to be, instead of being filled in as black floor slab, they might actually want to be lighter glass or something like that. So the other side of this is that because your poche is on a different layer, if I use the V key to get the move tool, you'll see that it actually is just laid on top of it like this. And the other flip side of it is that you can actually then play with the opacity a little bit. Obviously you don't want to play with it too much, otherwise some of the lines start showing up. But it basically kind of opens the avenue for manipulating the color a little bit. And these are your sort of poche sections by themselves. So eventually it actually becomes really easy to select these, and if you, in the case that you wanted to change the color of your poche as a whole, that would make it really easy to do as well. So that's the sort of one big advantage of actually taking this approach. So let's say in this case I'm actually finding the black to be a little bit too overpowering. So I'm going to actually just really quickly hide the base drawing so I can get this. And what I want to do is actually just select, go to the select color range, which will bring up this, right? And I can just sample the black color, for example, say okay, and should give me a selection of everything that's black in the drawing. And actually change this to something that's maybe a little bit slightly, a dark gray or something like that. Right, and then use the paint bucket tool to kind of go through and fill things in and basically change the color. The other sort of way to do it is actually just use the paintbrush tool and go in with a really huge brush. I don't think actually the capture software captures the brush size on this, but I'm just using a really big brush And because you've selected certain regions, it will actually only paint the parts that you selected. So deselect that, bring back the background. Okay, so that looks a little bit more balanced, right? You don't have like this huge, massive black volume. And now I'm actually just gonna, while we're at it, use the rectangular marquee tool to basically make a fake ground for the project to sit on. So I'm gonna select that. Same thing, just paint it in. And even if it's not completely, I didn't actually make it completely sit there. This part, I can go back to the rectangular marquee that I did earlier, right? Zoom in a little bit and say, well, okay, it needs to move up a little bit. So if you have the move key selected, you can actually use the arrow. Well, you can actually color it in and then move back to the move key and actually nudge using your arrow keys to move it up and down a little bit. And that will kind of like ensure that things are touching, if that's what you were trying to do, just to make sure that it's sitting correctly. Eventually you can crop out the bottom if you want. So I'm not going to worry about that right now. All right. And so one of the other things you can really try to do in the sort of section drawing like this is actually try to use or bring out the depth, right, of the other elements. So the things that are sort of closer versus the things that are sort of further away. And some of these we might actually change into textures eventually, but I just kind of want to illustrate the point that, let's say, if we make a new layer, and this time let's call it, let's say, shades, for example. And instead of this sort of darker poche, you go with the slightly lighter gray. And eventually you can pick, like, for example, regions like this that are maybe some linears or a frame or something like that. And you highlight that. And for this, I think actually going back to the base drawing and using the magic wand to select these regions actually is pretty helpful. And this is just a way that perhaps can help you tease out some of the depth differences of your sort of section drawing. And then go back to the shades layer, right? Use the paint bucket tool to paint that in. Control D to deselect, right? And so this is just one layer, but you can, the same way you guys work or manipulate line weights, you can easily imagine 3 or 4 different sort of shades of gray working within that. So you can go back, wand, zoom in a little to get some of the smaller stuff. Shift, holding down Shift to add to the selection. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. It's going to take too long. Right, and you'll see the magic wand can actually be, you can get relatively precise results with it. So change back to the shades layer again. Use the paint bucket G and fill that in. Right, so you'll start to see the sort of teasing out of the different levels and layers within the drawing. Okay, so I guess let's say the next thing you wanted to do, and I actually forgot to really look at the model, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that this was actually a glass pane. And if there are parts of this that were originally glass or wanted to be shown as glass, then when you cut through the section cut, you don't necessarily actually want to poche as completely dark black. So actually, let's go back. I'm going to hide the background and the shades layer and go back to the poche layer. And I'm just going to actually use the eraser and just delete that out. Erase it out. Okay, so that's back to what it was before, right? And let's just suppose that instead of that black, we want a blue. So let's find a blue here. We can click here and there, and find a nice light blue. Okay. So same thing. Go back to the base drawing. Use your magic wand. Click there. Maybe let's make a new layer. Double click on it and call it glass. You probably want to arrange it so it's on the top there. And then same thing, paint it in. Undo, right? So just for the sake of argument, right? I don't know actually in this model which parts were glass or which parts weren't, but you know, that kind of looks right. And maybe this little L here. If I'm working on already working on the glass there, then I can actually just use the marquee selection or the rectangular marquee selection and just do this one, hold down shift to do the next one, two, like that, and change the G and just fill it in that way. Now I guess the sort of difference you'll see is that this one is bound by the line work, where this one, depending on how accurate you were, sometimes isn't, right? But even if you did that, I would probably bump down the opacity just a little bit, so it kind of gets that sort of sense of transparency rather than being a complete solid blue. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show in this video is applying a realistic, well, not necessarily realistic, but a texture that you could grab off of the internet. And that's actually something that I've linked in the page for this. Some of the online resources. You'll actually find an image database here called GoubleTree, which you can search for stuff. But in this case, you're actually looking for, let's say in this case, CG textures, right? These are generally flat textures. So you can find, let's say, concrete, and these are all sort of downloadable concrete textures, or this site textures, which is more or less the same thing. You can actually, or you can just do a Google search. Often you'll find you can just Google search concrete textures, and these are all nice textures that you can use. But in my case, I already have prepared a concrete texture that looks like this, right? And so this I'll provide to you in the class materials as well. So this basically, let's just open this in Photoshop as its sort of own separate file. Okay. So let's see. One of the things I will want to do is actually, of course, make a new layer for it. So let's call this, double click on the name, conc01. Okay. And switch over to the concrete sort of texture. And usually what I do is I just Control A to select all. Or you can use the marquee tool to select something, it depends. Type V to get to the move command. And what I do is actually I click, I drag it, and I hover over the sort of section drawing you want. And you come into the window and you let go, right? And when you let go, the concrete image basically gets inserted into the active layer you had active, and that was concrete 1. So it gets put on that layer. And so now I have the concrete texture in here. And let's just say, for the sake of argument in this case, I want to put it here roughly on that sort of bottom layer, on that sort of bottom wall. And so size-wise, it kind of looks out of proportion, so I'll use Control T, which is the transform, holding down Shift to constrain the proportions. If you don't like it, it'll do this. Basically, make it really skinny or really flat. Holding down T will constrain its proportions to kind of scale it down a little bit. Use V to kind of move it into place. And this is a point where you can actually, kind of make it semi-transparent by clicking on this sort of opacity here, scale here on the right, and enter to complete the transformation. So now I'll just sort of like roughly move it into place, right? Now what I want to do is actually use this as a guide to help me say, well, what parts do I want to delete or cut out? And this is one way, this is one of the ways you can do this. I'll show another way later. So this way, basically use the rectangular marquee tool to kind of get to delete. You can do this and delete out the parts that you don't want. And if you're actually seeing, okay, I just accidentally had a seam there, make sure you're still selecting the concrete layer, and you can actually nudge it. Use the arrow keys to move it up and down. So I'm just going to move it down, make sure it covers that, right? The other sort of alternative way of like taking this out really quickly is actually to do a marquee selection of what you want roughly first, and then inverting the selection. So select, where is it? Inverse, Shift Control I. I usually just use Shift Control I, but this is just to show you where it is. And I'll select everything else. It will basically flip the selection. And so in this case, it's selecting everything else except for this part. And then you can just delete. And that deletes out everything else. Right? So now you have to basically sort of go in and, say, well, let's kind of delete out these little parts that are, this part that has the wall running through it, and this part that has the wall running through it, and basically the stairs, right? And the stairs can be a little bit more of a pain, so using that sort of selection method. So actually, let's just go to the base drawing layer and use the wand and shift select all this stuff. 2, 3, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And this, yeah. Okay. And then turn on your concrete layer again, make it active, and delete, right, which clears it out perfectly. And then you can bump your opacity back up roughly, and you'll see, okay, now you have a texture in there. Right? Cool. That's it for this video, and we'll continue in the next one.